Thus far in these ranking videos, I've covered companies that were founded in the early 80s, and in many cases were founded by unhappy Atari employees looking for more compensation and recognition for their talents. But this time around, it's a company with quite a bit more history. We're talking about Parker Brothers. In this video, I'm going to rank all 21 Parker Brothers titles released for the Atari VCS, and we're going to get started right after this. This video supported in part by...
Playing VR, I tend to sweat. It gives me an edge. So King of Nerds happens to give me an edge too. Let King of Nerds give you the edge. Bye, King of Nerds.
Hey there, welcome back to GenXGrownUp. I'm John, and I am a GenXGrownUp. Thank you so much for the click. So yeah, we're talking here about Parker Brothers and their games for the Atari VCS. Now, Parker Brothers was founded in 1883 by George S. Parker. Later, his brother came on board, thus the Parker Brothers. Now, they had been going strong, making games and some electronic games for 99 years before they ultimately decided to jump into the home video game market in 1982. Now, their MO was largely to license existing successful arcade games and computer games, and even grabbed a few notable franchises, Star Wars, which became the basis for the vast majority of their contribution to the Atari VCS library. Now, if you have watched any of my tier ranking videos before, you know that I want to look at these games from the standpoint of little Johnny, a little 10-year-old me. What would I have thought of these games had I spent my allowance or talked my parents into going to the mall, down to Electronics Boutique, and buying one of these games? And I get it home and open it, what's it like? Well, to that end, remember, we're only going to cover games that were actually released back when little Johnny could have played them. So we're talking about games that actually came out back 82, 83, 84, back when Parker Brothers was putting stuff out. Now, here's the thing. I mentioned that Parker Brothers did a lot of arcade game ports. So in this video, I'm trying to shy away from judging a game based on how good of a port it is, but just how much fun it is to play on its own merits. Now, it's impossible to detach the fact that it's a port, because little Johnny would have cared and it would have influenced his enjoyment, but I'm going to do my best to compartmentalize the arcade portness of these games and talk about just how fun the games are, and based on that, give it my ranking. So with that baseline established, no better time to start than right now. We're going to get going with the first one alphabetically, which is Amidar. The original Amidar in the arcade is a kind of a crazy fever dream, and that was carried over here in the Parker Brothers port of Amidar. Look, the concept is you're running around in a maze. It's kind of Pac-Man driven, right? You're trying to cover every spot in a maze and dodge these enemies. You are either, based on which level you're on, a gorilla dodging warriors, or a paint roller dodging pigs. I know, that's literally what, and it's in the manual. I'm not lying to you. Unlike Pac-Man though, you have a couple of weapons at your disposal. You don't have power pellets, but if you can enclose the boxes in the corners of the screen, your enemies will turn invincible for a little while, much like Ghost and Pac-Man turning blue, and you can chase them down. Also, throughout the game, you have a few jump buttons that you can hit. So on that trigger button on your joystick, you hit that, and the enemies become invisible for a while, that you can move past them. In the arcade game, they actually hopped. They couldn't do that. But look, Amidar was a moderately popular arcade game that it borrows liberally from Pac-Man, and this VCS port is that and less. Aside from the gorilla paint roller cycling, Amidar doesn't offer much in the way of variety or any real sense of accomplishment. So the best I can do for Amidar gets us off to kind of a weak start. It's gonna be a D. All right, moving along then to Frogger, a game that needs no introduction. Frogger was a staple of arcades and one that I think everybody on the planet recognizes at a glance. So I'm not gonna waste too much time here other than to say that Frogger was a remarkably good port onto the VCS. And aside from just being a good port, it's a fun game. It retains the vast majority of the gameplay from Frogger despite the graphical limitations. You have water, you have logs, you have cars, you have a street, you have lady frogs, you have alligators, you have all these enemies. It's Frogger. And yes, before you ask, I am familiar with the Frogger that was released on the Starpath Supercharger around the same time. It was called the official version and had improved graphics, but as that was not released by Parker Brothers, we're talking about the Frogger they released. That Starpath one might even score better. I'm going to give Frogger by Parker Brothers an A on our tier. Now, if you like Frogger, you're in for a treat because the next one up is Frogger 2 3 Deep. Or maybe you're supposed to say it 3 Deep. and sound like a frog. I think I'll go with that. So look, if you like Frogger and haven't played this sequel, you better strap in for a good time. Frogger 2 3 Deep consists of 3 entire scenes that you can play. There's an underwater level, there's what they call the surface level, and then you have the air level. Now the surface plays much like the original Frogger, except when you fall in the water, instead of drowning, you fall back to the underwater screen. The underwater and air scenes have their own unique sets of enemies and rideables and obstacles. Like you can ride the mama duck to get to the air, but avoid the mama duck if you're riding on one of her baby ducks. There's all kinds of cool little rules in this. It's absolutely Frogger taken up a notch, and that's a good thing. And unlike another Part 1, Part 2 later on this list, Frogger 2 3 Deep takes the basic mechanics of Frogger and builds a more interesting and rewarding game on top of the whole cross the road and the river deal. So Frogger 2 3 Deep, maybe surprisingly, is going to be our first S-ranked game on the Parker Brothers tier. Now, if you grew up playing Atari in Europe, you probably know this next game as Action Force, but here in North America, it was called G.I. Joe Cobra Strike. It's one of the two that actually use paddles instead of a joystick. You use your paddle in 2 ways here during the game. So when you move left and right without pushing the fire button, you're moving this shield that you're using to protect your Joes from bullets being fired from this giant cobra. When you hold down the button, though, you fire a bullet from your turret and you use your paddle to steer the bullet and try to hit that snake in its face. There's some really interesting mechanics going on here in that you kind of set your paddle in motion, and when you hit the button, it continues to move a bit, so you can set velocity and kind of multitask. Plus, this is one of the only games that I can recall for more than 2 players aside from the likes of Warlords or games where you have to take turns. 2 players can use paddles to protect the Joes, or you can plug a joystick in the second port and you can be the bad guy. You can be the giant cobra that is trying to fight, so you can play against your buddies competitively and cooperatively all in the same game, which I think is pretty cool. Once you get the hang of this game, it's a lot of fun. I'm guessing I never picked it up because I didn't collect G.I. Joes, so it didn't leap off the shelf at me because of the name of the game, but there's a great game underlying here without even a need for the G.I. Joe franchise, so I'm going to give G.I. Joe Cobra Strike a B on our tier. Up next is another arcade port, and it's Gyrus. Yeah, you hear that cool music. It's coming out of a VCS. That's Toccata and Fugue in D minor by Bach, the very song that was on the original arcade game that's used here, and that's actually the only sound in the game. We'll get to that in just a second. This is basically a really good translation of arcade Gyrus, but with a cheat code because, the 2600 only has limited items available on screen. But it does include things like multiple waves of enemies, satellites you can shoot down to get a double shooter, and even that chance bonus, which is kind of like a Galaga challenging stage where you can get bonus points for taking everybody down. Look, it looks sparse, and it plays well. There's no sound other than the music, as I said, so no explosions, no firing bullets, nothing like that, but it's a lot of fun to play, and who doesn't like saying 2 warps to Uranus? I mean, that's just fun, so Gyrus is going to get a B on my tier. This next one is not an arcade port, but is a game based on a popular franchise, James Bond 007. At a glance, you might think, oh, this is kind of Moon Patrol-like, and I understand why you might think that, but it's nowhere near as good as Moon Patrol. The idea here in James Bond is it loosely covers the plot of 3 Bond films, and it has an ending and a score you can get if you can finish all of this. But for being a super spy game, this is unnecessarily complex, and the core game is just unsatisfying. Look, there are lots of enemies swarming the sky, dropping things at you. You can fire bullets and bombs, but guess what? You can't shoot the enemies. No, you heard me right. You can't shoot anything other than these diamonds that flash the sky so you can see stuff in the background. So there's not much satisfaction in playing because you don't feel like you're doing anything other than just trying to not get hit. You're just dodging stuff. That's why I said it's nowhere near as good as Moon Patrol. So what you get in James Bond is unsatisfying gameplay, high difficulty with no reward. This is going to be an F. Sorry, James. I guess they stirred that game instead of shaking it. That's probably what went wrong. Up next is Montezuma's Revenge. Now, this is something if you're not familiar with it. Montezuma's Revenge is a multi-screen adventure platformer with a variety of hazards and enemies and tools and objects, more than just the key and door paradigm, right? There's stuff like a sword and a torch and an amulet. And they all have special functions, like the torch is good for seeing in the dark and the sword is good for some enemies, but not all enemies. For others, you need the amulet. It's this really good kind of rock, paper, scissors thing they have going. Plus, there's a whole sense of exploration without the feeling of repetition. Look, we all love Pitfall, but it can feel a little samey after a while as you're navigating the same rope swing and the same snakes and the same stuff. Montezuma's Revenge mitigates that by having so much more to do and to explore. You play the game as Panama Joe, this kind of Indiana Jones-like spelunker and explorer, and he fits right in here because that sense of exploration is absolutely felt and appreciated and feels way more mature than it ought to be on the VCS. So this is one, in case you missed it, don't miss it anymore, this is an S on my tier without a doubt. Okay, up next is another arcade port of a game that I love in the arcade. We're talking about Mr. Do's Castle. This port of Mr. Do has 6 different screens to explore, but you probably aren't gonna care. Look, this is another game that has tons of great music on the VCS, but no more game sounds. But if it were just that, that would be okay, but here's the problem. You wander levels trying to smash all these cherry blocks. You know how Mr. Do is played, and you have to avoid and try to squish these unicorns. I know, those are supposed to be unicorns, trust me. Control here is absolutely atrocious, though. Moving your character is a pain. Swinging that hammer looks like he's going absolutely bananas on it, and sometimes it looks like you're hitting a brick when you're not. You usually have to stop, take a couple steps, turn around, try to hit the brick. In the meantime, the unicorn has grabbed you. Plus, hitting blocks in general is just super finicky, and kicking ladders, the game just controls poorly. Forget about the music, forget about the basis of the original game. Mr. Do's Castle is just garbage on the 2600. It does play okay if you can get over those problems, which is the only reason it's not an F, it's just a D. Now, from one arcade port done poorly to one done incredibly well, it's time to move on to Popeye. Now, this Popeye is a remarkably faithful port, and while some ports dump all of their effort into the graphics and miss out on the gameplay, Popeye went the other way entirely. The graphics look pretty bad and pretty blocky and very rudimentary, but the core gameplay of Popeye, what made it fun in the arcade, it's captured here. You have multiple stages, you have punching bottles, you have grabbing the spinach power-up, you have the thing where Brutus can jump up at you or jump down at you from the different levels, all while you're trying to collect either notes or hearts or whatever it is that Olive Oyl is throwing down to you. The Parker Brothers Popeye on the VCS is just a fun game, whether it's an arcade port or not, and it's going to rank an A on my tier list. Okay, ready for another arcade port? This time, it's Q*bert, an arcade game that ranks right up there with the likes of Pac-Man, Galaga, and Donkey Kong as being some of the most famous and beloved. And the VCS port here, it's really quite good. And though I'm not judging this on how good of a port it is, look, if the arcade game was good and you do a good port, what you're going to end up with is a good game, and that's what Q*bert is. Very few corners were cut. You have the progression in levels where sometimes you have to jump on blocks once, sometimes twice. Later they get to where you can change them back. You have all the same enemies, granted not as frequently because you can't put so many moving objects on the screen at once, but everybody's on there. I can jump off the edge to the disc and Coily will fall to his death. I love it. He even curses when he dies, exactly what you want out of Q*bert. And there's one really cool thing I want to point out here that illustrates a real economy of programming on the VCS. Rather than spend precious graphics and processing time drawing a block that shows you what color the blocks need to be, your score and extra man are rendered in the color that you need the blocks to be. I think that's just a clever way to get the same information across with less data. And for this and so many more reasons, Q*bert is another S on our tier list. So I hope you really enjoyed Q*bert, because the next one up is the sequel to Q*bert, Q*bert's Cubes. Now, I said if you do a great port of a great arcade game, you're going to get a great game. Well, if you do an okay port of a weird, obscure, junky arcade game, guess what you get? You get Q*bert's Cubes. For me, the whole concept of Q*bert's Cubes is in question here, not just this Parker Vision port. Look, what happens if you take one of the most iconic action puzzle games of all time and then break it with unnecessary cube rotation mechanics? All right, maybe you like that, but then port it to a platform that's not capable of animating the very mechanic that makes Q*bert's Cubes unique? Yeah, I know I'm invoking the spirit of Erno Rubik here. Cubes presents you with a reference cube that you then must rotate remaining cubes to match with the same color orientation. And you want to play a kind of a game of tic-tac-toe to line a few of them up, but once you turn them, you can accidentally turn them back and it becomes nearly impossible to get them. Look, it's just not a fun game. It's too much work and it's too difficult to tell what's going to happen when you jump on or off of one of these cubes. I'm going to be generous here and give this a C, probably because of my love for the original Q*bert, not for any love for Q*bert's Cubes. Moving along now to a game very early in Parker Brothers' life of making 2600 games in 1982, and I'll admit I used to dislike this game because I didn't understand it, and the game is Reactor. Well, I can tell you I've now read the manual and played it for a substantial amount of time, so now I dislike it for an entirely different reason. I just don't find it to be much fun. The concept here is you're piloting a microscopic, I suppose, little ship in a nuclear reactor, and your job is to push these little particles into the wall before they do the same to you, all the while avoiding this pulsing core that's in the center of the game. The manual calls the walls in this game kill walls because, well, you guessed it, if you touch them, you die. But oddly enough, at least in the earlier stages, touching the core does not kill you, even though it's nuclear. You're just kind of going in a circle trying to get these little particles to run into the wall and not letting them shove you into the wall. I never felt any sense of fun or engagement or progression or any reason to play any further. I get that it's kind of innovative and it's early in the life. I think I'm going to be generous by giving Reactor a C. All right, let's get off a Reactor and move along to Sky Skipper. Now, this is a port of an arcade game, one that I had never played before I started learning about this port. The concept, it sounds crazy, I know, stay with me. You fly a biplane around a maze, bombing gorillas in order to free animals that the gorilla has trapped in cages. But don't fly your plane into the clouds or you'll crash, you know, like planes do when they hit clouds. You've got to manage your fuel when you're playing, and interestingly enough, you can refill your fuel by grabbing one of each animal in sequence. But by the time you do that, you've burnt so much fuel doing it that you're going to probably run out of fuel going back to pick up the rest of the animals. But despite that odd little game mechanic, the control here is just tight. Moving your plane is super precise, and the mazes are varied, and picking up the little animals is satisfying. This is going to be my firefighter of the Parker Brothers games. Look, for no tangible reason other than the one I stated at the beginning of the video, because little Johnny would absolutely love playing this game, despite how weird and simple it looks, I'm going to give Sky Skipper a B, because I found it to be just a lot of fun. All right, I'm going to swing by the Daily Bugle on my way to this next game, which is Spider-Man. Especially for a title released in 1982, the web-slinging mechanic here is pretty good, but the wall crawling leaves something to be desired because, spoiler alert, Spider-Man can't climb walls in this game. If you fall or your web fails, you'll hit the ground if you don't connect another web to the building again, which is kind of odd for Spider-Man rules, but it makes sense in the scope of this game, I guess. All of the progression in Spider-Man is reliant upon you learning the mechanic of swinging Spidey around, because the goal here is to touch an indeterminate number of either bombs or henchmen before the Green Goblin, who's hiding way up top, will trigger the super bomb. You'll hear this crazy noise, and then again you've got to swing your spider butt up to the top of the building and defuse that bomb before you proceed to a new building and get to do it all again. And despite any criticisms I had about the controls, once you learn the controls, Spider-Man is doing something different and innovative and providing that sense of accomplishment that's missing from a lot of VCS titles, so I'm giving Spider-Man a B. Okay, now I'm going to start treading on some dangerous ground. I know that Star Wars is sacred for many of you, and Parker Brothers did a fair number of Star Wars themed games. The first one we're going to talk about is Star Wars Return of the Jedi Death Star Battle. This game follows that Imagic model of having two different screens with separate goals. The first scene is kind of little consequence. You can see the Death Star out in the distance being assembled, and what you want to do is get there as quickly as you can. Blast a few TIE fighters, that'll open this little hole in energy shield. Wait for that opening, and then you're off to fight the Death Star. Now, since it's still under construction, you can blast pieces off of it a la Breakout, but your only real goal here is to get a shot into that infamous exhaust port. By the way, did you know that if you take the time to eliminate all the pieces of the Death Star, it'll earn you an extra Millennium Falcon? I didn't know that till I read the instructions. Anyhow, Death Star Battle is fine in short bursts, but little Johnny played this game, and I remember growing tired of it after just blowing up the Death Star a couple of times. It's okay, and what's the rating for okay? C. This next Star Wars game is probably the biggest puzzle to me. It's called Star Wars Jedi Arena. And I don't know who came up with that dumb name, but he should have workshopped it some more. At best, I could call this like Star Wars Padawan Arena, I think. Look, here's the thing. It's a lightsaber duel, one of the most exciting parts of any Star Wars film, except you and your opponent are standing too far apart to touch lightsabers. You're not doing a lightsaber fight. You're not a Jedi. Instead, you have that little orb from A New Hope. You know, the one that Luke was training with on the Falcon. That is between you and your enemy, and you're using your lightsaber to try to block electrical bursts from that thing that then charges up somehow your ability to attack your opponent from that same orb. It's just such a weird concept for a Star Wars game. And plus, every once in a while, that little orb just goes bananas and shoots both of you. And then, no matter how long you play, it's not until you destroy all the little bricks protecting your Jedi, because you know, Jedis have breakout bricks in front of them. Once you get through that and finally attack the other guy, you finally get 1 point. Then you switch sides and go again. Look, there's probably an interesting game here, but it's not an interesting Star Wars game. Maybe if it wasn't shoehorned into a lightsaber duel, I think they could have done something really cool with this. But as a Star Wars title, it's a C. Continuing with the Star Wars theme, it's right into Star Wars the arcade game. Now, for 1983, this is an audio-visual triumph. The Vector Star Wars arcade game had been dominating arcades, so I'm sure porting it to home systems was irresistible for Parker Brothers. Not only does this title have some good music and sound, but captures the look of the Vector arcade game surprisingly well for the VCS. And it all goes great right up until you start playing it and you realize what a slog it is. What could have been an action-packed movie thrill ride is instead a slow crawl through molasses as ships and bullets make their way leisurely around the screen. And they had better be slow because moving your targeting reticle and ship is just as sluggish, with some weird acceleration which means that movement isn't one-to-one. Plus, some rocket scientists at Parker Brothers decided you should not be able to move the targeting reticle unless you're not firing. That means you have to move, shoot, move, shoot. You can't keep shooting while you move or you're paralyzed. Who thought that up? Even when you get to the surface of the Death Star and you're running the trench, you never really feel like you're doing much other than suggesting a direction that you might maybe want to drift in. Look, Star Wars the arcade game looks good. Screenshots on the box probably sold it, but it's a D at best. Sticking with the Star Wars theme then and moving right along to the one you probably clicked on this video to see, and that's Star Wars The Empire Strikes Back. And believe me, I feel the pressure on this game, but I'm not caving in. I know this is an all-time Parker Brothers favorite, but let's look at it objectively. Imperial walkers are on their way to your rebel base, and you're piloting a lone snowspeeder tasked with holding off the attack. It takes dozens of shots to destroy a walker, or you can get a lucky pinpoint shot into an open bomb hatch. With an endless line of unchanging enemies, this could have been a generic Star Wars shooting game. But it's not mindless shooting, there's tons of strategy. You see, damaged walkers move more slowly, so weakening the lead walker and leaving him alive slows the whole line of walkers, giving you more time to wear down the next one. Then you return to blow up the first one in line once the second is weakened. I love how AT-AT Fire sends your speeder careening out of control for just a second, as it would, and how damage is displayed by color rather than some HUD. Plus, you can land your speeder up to 2 times for instant repair, and if you stay alive for 2 minutes, you get to use the Force and are invincible while that John Williams theme plays. Plus, there are options like solid body walkers and smart bombs to try out and other variations. This is just a damn good game, and maybe the best game Parker Brothers ever released for the VCS. Without a doubt, this is an S on my tier. So moving now from one legendary franchise to another, from Star Wars to Strawberry Shortcake. This is Strawberry Shortcake musical matchups. And look, it would be easy for me to dogpile on this game because it's an educational title intended for very young kids. But I can have fun with a game I'm too old for if there's something worthwhile in it. Strawberry Shortcake musical matchups is, at its core, a matching game. Each Strawberry Shortcake character has 3 elements: a head, a torso, and legs, and an accompanying song. On early difficulties, you just have to match up a set of graphics and hear the song and you'll see the name. On harder difficulties, it might even require you to hear and recognize the theme song and then build the appropriate character. The problem here is no variation, the songs are annoying, the chip tunes, if you want to call them that, are just way off key and grating, and you can't stop it once they start playing, you gotta hear the whole thing. I'm sorry, Strawberry, or Miss Shortcake if you prefer, your game only gets a D for me. Okay, we're gonna round out this tier with 2 more arcade ports, and the first one is one of my favorites, Super Cobra. Just like the arcade original, Super Cobra is a 10-level adventure where you fly through a cavern blasting rockets and bases and fuel tanks on your way to claim the treasure at the end of stage 10. It looks like things are moving one whole block at a time. Navigating your chopper is choppy, to say the least. If you can get a sense of how to control this weird block at a time chopper movement, and if you can get over the clunky scrolling, then at least this game does give a sense of progression. So there's some payoff. But it's like some dev knew the control was clunky, so to make your life easier, Super Cobra not only has a pause feature using that color black and white TV type switch, but also allows infinite continues after you lose all your chopper. Now reset your score to 0, but you can keep moving along and see the rest of the game. They'll even allow you to change the game speed with the game select switch between continued games. So if it's too tough, you can notch it down. So that's good. But all that herky-jerky movement on screen and the fact that when I move the stick, I don't know how far my chopper is going to move. I've wrecked into walls more time than I care to think about. The best I can do for Super Cobra is a C. I have one more, and if you think I saved the best for last, you are dead wrong. We're talking about Tutankhamun, based on another arcade game. As the kids say, this game is clunky AF. Tutankhamun is a spelunking adventure game where you gather treasure, avoid and try to kill enemies, and try to grab a key to escape the level. So, first of all, you can only fire left and right. That's normal, that's fine. But this game scrolls up and down, so you can't see left and right. It's just as wide as the screen, so that's a problem. It's easy to get killed accidentally when the screen is scrolling. Happened all the time to me. You can't move diagonally, but if you try to round a corner, you can get stuck on a corner. I guess one saving grace is that the enemies sometimes get stuck on a corner too, but even that's tough to exploit because you can't control your own self. Graphics-wise, the snake sprite looks pretty good, but everything else looks like a placeholder graphic in a prototype that never got done. I guess if I was looking for any kind of silver lining here, I'll say that when you change levels, the pitch of the sound effects changes to kind of give you that sense of increased urgency. But it's too bad that that idea didn't find its way to a much better game. Tutankhamun, in all of its glory, is our final game, and it is an F. So here's that completed Parker Brothers tier, and before I leave it, let's take a look. What can we learn by looking at this? Well, Parker Brothers had a few great titles, but the majority of their stuff was middle of the road, kind of average material. Now the ones that were good were great, and the ones that were bad were remarkably bad, but there's a lot of middle of the road stuff that's worth playing if you haven't explored it before. I have found that I love doing these tier ranking videos. They're a lot of work, but what I love about it is not the work, it's getting your reaction. I love hearing people, yay, you loved my game, or what's wrong with you, you hated my game. I get it, we all have our own experiences with these games, and those can bleed into their quality, or maybe I'm just wrong in some cases. So don't pull any punches. I love to hear from you down in the comments. Tell me what games you think I got wrong. Tell me what you would change, and tell me what tier you'd like to see me do next. I'm going to throw some links here and here to some other tier videos that I have done here on GenXGrownUp. I certainly hope you enjoyed this video, and I cannot wait to talk to you next time. Bye-bye.